Good morning, everyone. Um, Glad to be with you today, digitally. But anyway, back when I started the series on coronavirus, I was hoping that by the time I would be finishing up the series, we could be pretty close to going back to something a little bit more like normal life and normal church. But now it seems like we're still going to be doing things this way, at least for a little while longer, which is a bummer. Um, right now, we're on day 53 of quarantine, and we don't know for sure how long this is going to last or when it'll all end, at least here in LA County, and especially as it pertains to things like church. But in this time so far, already tens of thousands of people have died in our country. And honestly, we don't really know what the future holds. So it's easy at times like these where we're quarantining to get bored or angry that we're stuck here or sad because we know people who have passed away or just because we're lonely or whatever other negative emotion might come to us, right? So I'm going to actually change my original plan a bit. This was going to be our fifth and final week of that coronavirus series. But now we're going to kind of switch over to an Old Testament book that doesn't always get a lot of attention because I think it's going to be helpful for us in kind of sort of talking about the coronavirus. So we're actually going to do a little series on Habakkuk because the book is set in a similarly difficult situation. Not the same kind of situation because there's not a plague or something like that, but it's a bad situation and that they are not happy about, just like we're in a bad situation that we're not particularly happy about. So, anyway, let's set the stage. So, imagine right now that you're living in the kingdom of Judah around the year 605 BC. We don't know the exact year that Habakkuk was written, but we know it was sometime around then because a big battle took place that brought on the crisis that Habakkuk was so worried about in the book. We don't know if he saw it in advance in some way or if he was just responding to it, but since he's not predicting the crisis itself, it seems like he's responding to it. And he doesn't make specific predictions that Babylon is going to rise as a power. It's just kind of already assumed that they're powerful. But we know that it's probably written before 586 when the kingdom of Judah was totally destroyed, and also probably before 597 when it was partially destroyed. It seems like the most terrible things haven't happened yet. So, anyway, backstory for Judah, in case you guys don't know. Judah was a small nation in what is now southern Israel. As you might remember from the Bible history, there was a time when Israel was a single kingdom led by men like Saul, David, and Solomon. And especially when David and Solomon were king, Israel was a powerful country. But when Solomon died, it actually split into two kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south, in the year 931 BC. Israel, the northern kingdom, was actually the larger one to begin with, but it wasn't faithful to God. And so in 722, it was destroyed by Assyria because of their unfaithfulness. But at that same time, Judah had a faithful king. So although they were invaded and almost defeated, they survived because God protected them. But now in our story right in Habakkuk, it's been a little over 100 years later. And during this time, a lot of the kings have not been faithful. And as a result of their unfaithfulness, for a time period, God allowed Assyria to take advantage of Judah. They didn't totally wipe them out, but they were dominating them. And then after Assyria, there was a time period where Egypt was kind of doing that. Then for a while, there was a more faithful leader named Josiah. And he was actually able to break free from both nations, kind of make Israel more powerful and independent. But then he died, and a series of bad kings arose. And that was part of the crisis that's going on right now with Babylon. So this book is at the beginning of those bad kings where things are just falling apart for Judah. Basically, the countries of Egypt and Babylon, which is sometimes known as the Chaldeans. So in the text, we'll talk about them as the Chaldeans, but normally known as Babylon, are now fighting over who gets to conquer Judah, right? There's not much hope that Judah could actually fight off either of them or like make them fight each other so that they're fine. It's been reduced to just becoming such a small country without many people and without much military that someone's going to conquer them. And at this point, it's now pretty clear that Babylon is going to be the one who will oppress Judah. And eventually, they are the ones who actually destroy it. So their situation is in some ways like our situation, right? They're probably in a worse situation because they're going to get conquered completely. But we're in a bad situation right now where we're in a lockdown and there have been tens of thousands of deaths. And we're in a situation that might get worse because there might be like a second wave of COVID or a second lockdown or something like that. they in this story are probably already experiencing in some ways some form of invasion or recently experienced that, and they're expecting correctly an even larger invasion in the future. Whereas we don't really know that there will be a second wave of COVID or not. But anyway, unlike many of the prophets, in this book, Habakkuk isn't talking to the people of Judah to tell them what God wants. He's not speaking from God to the people. It's actually Habakkuk speaking to God and God speaking to Habakkuk. Just them having a conversation. So I'm going to read Habakkuk chapter 1, verses 1 through 11. The oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear, or cry to you violence, and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity, and why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted. Then God starts speaking. Look among the nations and see, wonder and be astounded. For I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings, not their own. They are dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than evening wolves. Their horsemen press proudly on. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle, swift to devour. They all come for violence, all their faces forward. They gather captives like sand. At kings they scoff, and at rulers they laugh. They laugh at every fortress, for they pile up earth and take it. Then they sweep by like the wind and go on. Guilty men, whose own might is their God. Okay, so that might have been a lot to take in. So first thing I want to do is I kind of want to rewrite Habakkuk's complaint for our own time. So sometimes I've updated the situation a little bit, and other times I've tried to paraphrase the words to make it a little bit easier, kind of bring out how something similar applies in our time. Okay, so it'd be something like this. Yahweh, how long shall I cry to you for help, and you will not hear? Or cry to you, disease and death, and you will not save? Why do you make me see this evil, and why do you look at wrongdoing and do nothing? Disease and death are always in front of me. Anger and restrictions are rising. So the law in society is paralyzed, and there is no real justice. The government has stopped normal life, so that justice in normal life cannot be done, and the poor and unprivileged fare the worst. Okay, because a lot of these things, some of it's about the disease, and some of the things that we're feeling right now are like we're maybe angry at China for not doing a better job of dealing with things or being honest about things from the beginning, or maybe we're mad that the state or other groups are not giving us the ability to have freedom. Or maybe we're looking at and we're realizing that, the people who fare the worst right now are generally speaking those who are already worst off. They're the unprivileged, they're the poor. Anyway, those are the kinds of things we might complain to God about. But the first thing that I want you to notice about what Habakkuk said, and not what I said, but about what Habakkuk said, is that God inspired Habakkuk to say that, right? God invited this kind of hard questioning and thought that it needed to happen because he needed to be able to address it. He actually, so much so did God want that to happen that he inspired and gave Habakkuk those words. And I think that at some level we are all asking God the question, why, right now? And maybe because we've generally been able to handle lots of these situations, like epidemics, with science in the past 100 years, we don't see this as part of the normal experience of life. This doesn't seem at all normal, even though this kind of thing used to happen more often. And in the past, the church actually had like special prayers that people would pray for times of pestilence or plague, ways of responding to God that were traditional. But honestly, we haven't had a plague like this in America for a little over 100 years, which means that's enough time that we've all forgotten about it. Right? We don't know very many people who were old enough to remember that time, which means that we haven't really thought of a lot of answers for a while because nobody's really been asking. and we've gotten out of this pattern. So let's take a look at what God says in response to Habakkuk and his situation of being invaded. What God says is he just talks about how he's going to raise up the Chaldeans, which is another word for the Babylonians, the people he's afraid of. But all you can see about God's response is that he is describing how bad they are. The only thing that God says in his own defense, really, is basically that whatever God is doing, Habakkuk would not believe him if he was told. Basically, God says to Habakkuk that the thing that he's concerned about is much worse than Habakkuk realizes. It would be like if God were to answer our concerns about the coronavirus by saying that the second wave is, in fact, going to kill far more people than the first wave killed, and that the restrictions are going to be far worse, right? I'm not saying that that's going to happen at all. That's the kind of answer that God gives to Habakkuk. He is just letting Habakkuk know that he would never really understand what God is doing in this situation, right? He's saying, look, it's actually worse than you thought, but part of this is just that you don't know what's going on. So just to recap where we are at right now in the book of Habakkuk, God inspires Habakkuk to ask him some really difficult questions about why there is evil, and this kind of evil specifically. And then God says, you wouldn't understand it why I told you. You can't understand me. And not only that, you don't even realize how bad it's going to be. It's going to be much worse. Whatever Habakkuk, whatever you're thinking about the Babylonian invasion, just imagine it worse than that, because that's what's going on. So that might not seem very comforting, and we also might not really know how to apply that to our lives, right? Okay, does that mean coronavirus is going to be worse? Not necessarily, right? These aren't the same things. And even if it was, like, what would we do about that? I don't really know. It just means that, things could be bad and God could still be in control. But anyway, the story will go on in Habakkuk, and we will get a little bit more that might seem applicable to us in the weeks to come. But I do want to highlight a couple things so far. Number one, we can ask God questions. And then number two, God knows more than we do. So we have to trust him without always understanding. So I think that that's actually key. God says that he's doing a great work in the world by letting Babylon conquer nations, even though Babylon is evil. God has his reasons. And it isn't our job to understand all of those reasons. We wouldn't honestly be able to believe them because they are just a little bit beyond us. It's just like would be over our head. But that doesn't mean that we can't ask or even come to know a little bit more, because it may be a little bit beyond our ability to know everything about why God is doing the things that he's doing, but that doesn't mean that we can't know more. Because Habakkuk gets that answer from God, and he responds. So let's listen to his response. And so starting in verse 12, Habakkuk from chapter 1, he says, "Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you have ordained them as a judgment, and you, O Rock, have established them for reproof. You who are of purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong, why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? You make mankind like the fish of the sea, like crawling things that have no ruler. He, meaning Babylon, brings all of them up with a hook. He drags them out with his net. He gathers them in his dragnet. So he rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices to his net and makes offering to his dragnet. For by them he lives in luxury, and his food is rich. Is he then able to keep on emptying his net and mercilessly killing nations forever? I take my stand upon the watchpost, and station myself on the tower, and look out to see what he will say to me, and what I will answer concerning my complaint." So Habakkuk responds by basically just complaining that the judgment does not seem totally fair. He understands that Judah has been unfaithful and is being punished, but it seems like Babylon is being rewarded, even though they are actually worse than Judah. And not only that, he talks about how Babylon is like a fisherman and the other kingdoms of the world are like fish. And he is getting rich off of destroying them, and it just seems like that's not just, and that's not good. And so when that first answer from God doesn't seem good enough to Habakkuk, he just asks again and makes more specific what he's upset about. So I think right now, if you're in a place where you're asking God why, or why are you letting this happen? Why are you letting the lockdown continue? Why are you letting people die of the disease? Why is any of this happening? I think you can take comfort in knowing that if all you really understand right now is that God is telling you that you can't understand it, you can keep asking. You can point out the parts that seem most unfair to you. For example, it doesn't seem like the US is really the worst nation in the world, but we're supposedly the most affected. So why is God letting that happen, for example? And those are all valid questions to ask, and it's okay to keep asking them to God, because we'll see how God responds to those questions next week. He doesn't leave them totally unanswered, even if he does not fully explain all the reasons for why he's doing things and the way that he's doing them. Next week, he gets into another answer that gets a little bit more specific. And then in the final week, we will look at how we should really respond as we go over in chapter 3. So in our lives this week, I honestly just want to encourage you to ask questions of God and to maybe even write them down and see what answers you think you might get if you looked them up in the Bible or if you hear something in prayer. Feel free to text me questions that you have too. Don't be shy. Obviously, I won't have all of the answers, but I might be able to help with some parts of your answer or at least point you to a passage in the Bible that could be helpful. And so that's kind of it for today from our teaching. So if you want to join the Zoom chat, we will discuss these questions. First one is just, can anyone recap the backstory to Habakkuk? What was going on in the world at that time? Number 2, why do you think Habakkuk is asking God questions? And then number 3, can we ask questions like Habakkuk? And if so, why would God let us ask questions like this? Okay, so that's it for today. Hope you join me in the Zoom chat at 11. You can follow the link below to kind of direct yourself there through the church website. So looking forward to that conversation and talk to you soon.